Welcome, everyone, to the second in our series of three evening panel discussions. Our question tonight is the human being redeemable? And the instructions we gave to each of the speakers who are here tonight is simply to respond to the question from their own perspective. And our hopes were that direct contemporary responses to questions that Rosenzweig was asking would help us open up the horizons of our scholarly discussions at the conference that we're in the middle of, and perhaps might also contribute something to the wider intellectual conversation here in Jerusalem. Is the human being redeemable is a question that follows on last night's panel, which asked, is the world redeemable? And last night we were treated to skeptical challenges, highlighting the dangers that are wrapped up in invoking the language of redemption, especially in the political context. We received a call to retreat from redemption, to retreat from the telos of redemption in the ultimate sense, and to return to the concrete, everyday context in which redemption could mean redemption from distress in a particular case, and perhaps even redemption from divine service in the case of Pidyon Haben. Very much for the sake of everyday life and for the experience of everyday kindness. And then we also heard last night an account of Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption as offering a model of worldly redemption, which integrated Machiavelli and the prophet Isaiah, which integrated worldly realpolitik and an anarchic and ethical ideal. And last night, Yunon Vigoda closed the evening by pointing out that when it comes to the question of the redeemability of the world, the human being plays a unique role in Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption, whereas the human being as part of the world is created by God, and while the human being is also the recipient of revelation, the human being has an active role to play in the redemption. And so he, as it were, passed the baton to us tonight in thinking about the human being in the context of redemption. But of course, our question tonight is not, is the human being the redeemer, but rather, is the human being redeemable? And the question implies that the human being finds herself in a condition in which she needs redemption, either because she is so constituted or for contingent reasons or for historical reasons, that there's some aspect of what the human being is or how the human being is that isn't as it should be. We might say, depending on how we understand redemption, there's some condition in which the human being finds herself from which she must be freed, or some state of incompleteness that must attain to closure in order for the human being to be what she is supposed to be. One might go so far as to argue that the human being is the only kind of being for whom redemption is an appropriate aim. We might say that God, of course, is that than which nothing greater can be thought, so it makes no sense to speak of the redeemability of God, although tune in for tomorrow night. And animals, we might say, live according to their nature. Their range of possibilities too limited to speak of their redemption. So we might argue that only the human being has the potential for both devaluation and elevation, such that it makes sense to speak of their needing redemption and of their attaining it. Now, in the opening of the Star, of course, Rosenzweig is concerned with a very particular kind of human limitation from which we seek to be redeemed. Vom Tode, vom der Furcht des Todes hebt alles Erkennen des All an. All knowledge of the all begins in death, in the fear of death, he writes. Rosenzweig recognized that the unique capacity for selfhood that the human being has is tied up with an awareness of her own individual mortality. And so perhaps then the redeemability of the human being we're asking about is redeemability from death. Of course, the star opens by disabusing us of just these kinds of fantasies, of redeeming the soul, granting it immortality at the price of allowing the body to die. And so Rosenzweig makes it clear that he thinks that the human being seeks a kind of redemption that's reconcilable with remaining in the world. Soll also nichts anderes als was schon will, bleiben. And so our discussion in this very concrete sense is also a continuation of last night's discussion of the redemption of the world. For the rest of our discussion, we are going to hear 3 papers. And after we hear the 3 papers, we're going to have a discussion among the speakers. We've asked each of the speakers also to pose a question to the others, and then I will chime in and raise some questions myself. I want to begin by introducing our first speaker, Professor Vivian Lee Scott, who's professor of German literature and the director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And since 2013, she's also the distinguished visiting professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's written very, very broadly in the field of modern Jewish thought and literature. Her books include German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, A Tenuous Legacy from 2017, Fremde Gemeinschaft, Deutsch-Jüdische Literatur der Moderne from 2011, and When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature from 2009. I introduce to you Professor Vivian Lee Scott.
Thank you, Benjamin. Is the human being redeemable? Thank you for inviting me to reflect on this momentous. I first wrote potentious, but then I checked it and changed it to momentous question, which sounds both familiar and strange to me. It reminds me of Karl Kraus' quip about the philologist's attentiveness to the word. The closer you look at it, the stranger it looks back. Having studied modern messianic thought of various kinds for years, the question is indeed most familiar. At the same time, I'm grateful for this opportunity to let it stare back at me in strange, even uncanny ways. Whence my unease? Is the human being redeemable? Perhaps I'm uneasy because the question suggests that we're being asked whether the human being can be redeemed and doesn't bother to ask about the should. Should it be redeemed? It assumes that redemption is the preferred human destiny. Or perhaps my unease derives from the generalized figure of the human being, which overrides concreteness, singularity, cultural, historical, and religious differences related to goals, desires, hopes. And I was very pleased to hear you use the she form. She needs to be redeemed. It somehow sounded differently than he needs to be redeemed.
Should she?
Is it the seemingly neutral and detached mode of the question that invites a definition of the human being, a characterization of its essence, a disinterested diagnosis of its worth and prospects? Or am I, on the contrary, being addressed and challenged with a so-called Gretchenfrage, as when Margarete questions Faust whether he's a believer? Do I believe in redemption? Who is speaking here anyway, and to whom? Is the question asked from an outside source, or rather from above, as if from a God's eyes view? What is implied in the implicit passive form of the question? When typing the question, can the human being be redeemed, my spell check said, passive voice, consider revising. Or are we overhearing the Messiah who, in an interior monologue, wonders about the success rate of his endeavor? My initial response to the question is rather straightforward. No, the human being is not redeemable. If being redeemed is a state of being, then the human being cannot be redeemed because the question is self-defeating. A redeemed human being is no longer human. Being redeemed means literally freigekauft, bought out. Something has to be given, renounced, relinquished, or sacrificed in order to liberate the human being from a state of bondage, from being held hostage, or just from limitations, imperfections, or, as you said and emphasized, mortality. In short, from the condition humaine. Franz Rosenzweig, in the last words of The Star, suggests precisely this when he releases the Mensch back into life, freeing him from the place where God's radiance shines too strongly, where, in Rosenzweig's words, kein Mensch leben bleiben kann. To some extent, these questions concern all varieties of messianic or redemptive thinking. Yet the range of replies, even when limited to the past 100 years, opens up a wide spectrum of views about God, the world, and indeed the human being. In some of these messianic visions, however, redemption, unlike to be redeemed, is not a state of being. For Adorno, and here I'm giving examples that I don't necessarily embrace, for Adorno, the redeemed world is merely a perspective from which our world should be viewed. At the end of his Minima Moralia, he suggests that redemption is primarily a measure to unmask the existing world and its inhabitants in their full failure and misery, and he adds, it doesn't matter if this is ever going to happen or not. Jacques Derrida posits redemption as a mere structure of receptivity to what is to come. Some regard it as mere consolation for the religious-minded. Others see it as the hope eventually to be able to learn Torah without the fear of enemies. In the context of these visions, the question whether the human being can be redeemed may not even arise or would have a different tonality than with Rosenzweig, and particularly at a Rosenzweig conference called Back to Redemption. There is something uncanny about Rosenzweig's description in The Star of the ultimate state of completion, fulfillment, eternity. Das ungeheure Unisono des Allstimmigen, das Triumphgeschrei des Ewigen, vor dem der Tod ins Nichts stürzt, when life becomes unsterblich im ewigen Lobgesang der Erlösung. I'm not translating these. I trust that it's enough to hear the sound. How desirable is a state in which so much has to be undone, lost, and dismissed in order to retain nothing but the one, the all, the eternal, and the true? I'm similarly wary of Rosenzweig's portrayal of the ways that this state of being redeemed is anticipated in life, through prayer, ritual, love of neighbor, the communal hymn of the we. How accessible are these to the human being as such? Rather than arguing against what sounds like a grand remnant of the Hegelian Drang zum großen Ganzen, the urge for the grand whole, I want to invoke two figures whose concepts of redemption in some ways resemble Rosenzweig's. Their differences from him, however, make all the difference to me. In 1921, the year Rosenzweig published The Star, Walter Benjamin writes the Theologisch-Politisches Fragment, and Franz Kafka pens a letter to his friend Robert Klopstock, in which he imagines another Abraham. Both texts depict a theological scene featuring imminent redemption or its preconditioned revelation, but in both, the finality of redemption is held at bay. The influence Rosenzweig had on Benjamin has been the topic of many a scholarly study, and there are no doubt important parallels in their views of time, history, and language. Rosenzweig in turn read Kafka at least enough of his works to enable him to write on 2 May 1925 in a letter to his cousin, "The people who wrote the Bible seem to have thought of God much in the same way Kafka did." I would have loved to hear the full argument, but as far as I know, doesn't exist. Neither Benjamin nor Kafka shied away from thinking about the world's end and playing hide and seek with the Messiah. And yet, in many ways, the theologisch-politisches Fragment, Benjamin's most explicitly messianic text, particularly its first lines, seem close to Rosenzweig. I quote, "Nothing historical can intend to refer to the messianic from itself out of itself. For this reason, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be directed toward a goal. Historically seen, it is not goal, but end. Thus, the order of the profane cannot be built on the idea of the kingdom of God." However, Benjamin depicts messianic intensity, messianische Intensität, and the dynamics of the profane, die Dynamis des Profanen, in the form of two parallel arrows. The arrows point in opposite directions, but, so Benjamin, propel one another forward. I have not yet found the physical law that confirms this, but this is at least the image that we get. As for Rosenzweig, the kingdom of God cannot be established through progress in history. For Benjamin, however, its anticipation is not in a straight line with its telos. It is indeed conceived dialectically through the mighty detour of achieving happiness on earth. Unlike Rosenzweig, Benjamin radically and explicitly refrains from depicting, and I quote Benjamin, what the situation of a redeemed humanity might actually be, what conditions are required for the development of such a situation, and when this development can be expected to occur. End of quote. But Benjamin, too, anticipates redemption. He writes that each generation is endowed with a weak messianic force. For him, anticipation of redemption does not occur in prayer, ritual, and communal hymn. The messianic forces are themselves historical. They change with each generation. Benjamin's messianic sparks and splinters are embodied in various unexpected figures and dispositions, from Mémoire involontaire to a leibhaftige Geistesgegenwart, embodied presence of mind, from the flaneur to the collector, from the translator to the materialist historian, from the storyteller and the chronicler to the last reminiscences of the dying man. Importantly, Kafka's students of the law are among these figures. In a letter to Scholem about Kafka, Benjamin describes the places where he searches for such anticipatory traces of redemption as, quote, the hidden lining of things. Concealed in the seeming banality of the everyday, these figures share a fleeting intensity of attention to the small and the forgotten. Rosenzweig's turn to the everyday undoubtedly echoes Benjamin, or rather the other way around, but there are parallels. So Rosenzweig certainly speaks of the everyday, but there is little in the star of the spontaneous and unexpected, of the attachment to the most insignificant scraps of the past. Benjamin speaks of the Lumpensammler, of the passion for the concrete that is manifest in Benjamin's redemptive figures. Benjamin could have included Kafka's Abraham in his messianic cast of characters. I can imagine another Abraham is the first sentence of a text included in a letter Kafka wrote to Klopstock in June 1921. Kafka's alternate Abraham comes as an implicit response to Kierkegaard's praise of Abraham's loving obedience to God's call. Kafka imagines an Abraham who would not ascend Mount Moriah to sacrifice his beloved son. This Abraham, Kafka writes, to be sure, would not make it all the way to patriarch, not even to old clothes dealer. Like the biblical patriarch, Kafka's other Abraham is a pious man ready to obey the command for his son's sacrifice, quote, with the promptness of a waiter. In contrast to the biblical Abraham, however, Kafka's Abraham politely declines the summons. In keeping with his potential to with Abraham's potential to negotiate with God in other instances in the Bible, Kafka's Abraham argues that, quote, he cannot get away from home. He's indispensable. The household needs him. There's always something that must be attended to. The house isn't finished. Kafka continues this phantasmagoria and elaborates on Abraham's excuses for procrastinating rather than obeying God's order. His other Abraham now stands in the plural, for he has become a type and attitude. The other Abrahams, quote, they stand on their building sites and suddenly have to go up on Mount Moriah. These Abrahams, as imagined by Kafka, are called by God while they are attending to their daily lives. The divine injunction reaches them when they are in the midst of their home, their house, their world building, whereupon they are ordered to abandon all this, to go to the mount, as much as these other Abrahams would otherwise have been willing to oblige. They are too immersed in tending to their building site, their Bauplatz, and cannot heed God's call. 2 years after writing this letter, Kafka penned a story called Der Bau, a long monologue by a mole-like animal obsessively attending to his burrow. The animal constantly makes observations and decisions and confirms facts, only instantly to dismiss them with a but or a however, and replace them with a variety of alternatives that in turn meet the same fate. The incessant reflections and calculations suggest an endless task and express a continuous frustration about never grasping the whole. The burrow can neither be fully repaired nor completed, yet also neither abandoned nor truly inhabited. It thus perfectly embodies Kafka's own writing, which likewise continuously cancels itself, thus becoming an infinite process exceeding any purpose and result. Kafka, or rather his mole, also has his Rosenzweig moment. On the story's final pages, the animal, both fearing and hoping for an interruption, hears a noise. It imagines that, quote, someone may be calling me to him. With an, the quote continues, invitation I will not be able to resist. Dass mich jemand zu sich rufen wird, dessen Einladung ich nicht werde widerstehen können. The animal soon conjectures that the noise comes not from any little animals, but from one single large one, possibly the one extending the irresistible summons. The creature continues to go about its business, however, and the story, after 16 closely written manuscript pages and yet another but, breaks off in mid-sentence, suggesting that it might go on infinitely. The final sentence of Kafka's first scene, in his imagining of another Abraham, provides an explanation for this endlessness precisely in the face of a possible call from a unique and ominous someone. Referring to his other Abrahams who resist the call from and to the mount in the distance because they must attend to their houses, Kafka speculates. All we can do is suspect that these men are deliberately not finishing their houses, so as not to have to lift their eyes and see the mountain that stands in the distance. The mountain is Mount Moriah, where Abraham was meant to sacrifice his son, yet it could also be Mount Sinai, the site of Revelation itself. Kafka's other Abraham illustrates Benjamin's identification of Kafka's stories with Haggadic tales that constantly pause, luxuriating in the most detailed descriptions, in the simultaneous, I'm quoting, hope and fear of encountering the law, the truth, or God. Benjamin calls this ambivalence of hope and fear in encountering the absolute procrastination, Verzögerung. Benjamin's dialectical arrows could still be interpreted as a mere intensification of Rosenzweig's introduction of the all and the eternal into the everyday. Yet Kafka's continuous hesitations, his endless imagining of alternatives, his deliberate and potential infinite postponement of reaching the mount display a resistance to that which in redemption, as conceived in the star, would spell the end of the human as we know it. Because what would end would be the very idea of possibility. The end of Rosenzweig's star signals such resistance. The star indeed does not end with redemption. Its final words into life were enacted by Rosenzweig in his life with the establishment of the Lehrhaus and in his subsequent writings such as Die Bauleute, the builders, where law and Lehre are performed for the sake of transmission and where chains of generations are regarded as Bauleute of an expanding building site whose end is not in sight. How does this observation relate to our question whether the human being can be redeemed? In one of his letters to Gritli, Rosenzweig suggests that the ending of the star represents a return to a past stage, back to the human realm of life from the place where men cannot live. Isn't this ending and what follows rather an invitation to go back from redemption? and his Bauleute close to Kafka's Abrahams, who in both hope and fear not only care for their house, but even deliberately extend their Bauplatz so as to defer the end. In the course of this endeavor, the expansion of the tent, der Zeltpflöcke, as dwelling place for human beings, these builders of the here and now may catch a glimpse not only of Kafka's Abraham beside them, but also of Benjamin's arrow flying by in the opposite direction, towards the kingdom of God.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Liska, for this stimulating, very provocative talk. We'll continue to discuss this, but first we're going to hear our other speakers, and then we'll have time for a discussion all together. Our next speaker is Professor Hans Martin Dober, who's a professor for praktische Theologie in the Department of Protestant Theology at the University of Tubingen, and since 2003, also the Pfarrer der Evangelische Landeskirche an der Versöhnungskirche in Tuttlingen. He's written many important books. I will single out what I only learned now was his dissertation, Die Zeit ernst nehmen, Studien zu Franz Rosenzweigs Der Stern der Erlösung from 1990. I single it out because when I was a graduate student working on my dissertation on Rosenzweig, this was a very important book for me. But since then, Professor Dober has been busy writing. I mentioned just a few of his works, Die moderne Wahrnehmen über Religion im Werk Walter Benjamins from 2002, Seelsorge bei Luther, Schleiermacher und nach Freud from 2008, and recently Erlebnisse zu Erfahrungen bilden, Predigten mit Filmen im Gespräch from 2016. Professor Dober.
Thank you. I would like to stand.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends of the Rosenzweig Society, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to take part at this panel, and I thank Dana Rubinstein for the help with the translation. I want to share some reflections from the perspective of philosophical anthropology, which can be of some help in my work as a Christian theologian and, as you said, as a minister of the Protestant Church. In this perspective, it is no wonder that man hopes for and has produced the concept of redemption. Only he could have related to his finite nature. Afflicted with illness, pain, sorrows, and weakness, he must, to this day, be taught gently that he will have to pass away someday. However, it is not only his finite nature or his contemporaries who can make his life difficult. As Sigmund Freud has already shown, man is fundamentally threatened from the inside. His instincts and impulses are the source of anxiety, and his conscience is the source of his feelings of guilt. In all this, man is in need of help once in a while, and he is in need of consolation. Both meanings resonate in the religiously laden term redemption, which we find in Rosenzweig. To put it with Hans Blumenberg, and I relate to his lecture's description of man, man is in the need of consolation and capable of receiving consolation, but sadly sometimes remains inconsolable. Following the lead of Blumenberg's ethics of consolation in what follows, I would like to inquire into both viable and more problematic ideas of redemption. The latter ones have increased awareness of being unredeemed and elicited a new need for redemption. I will restrict myself to discuss some dogmas and phenomena in Christianity. There is an inextricable correlation between the concept of man and the idea of redemption. Therefore, I will begin with Rosenzweig's understanding of man that in some aspects proves astonishingly similar to that of Martin Luther. Secondly, I will take a quick look at the critique of religion in modern times insofar as it can be read as a critique of the Christian concept of redemption. Third, I will turn to the question how redemption can be related to consolation. What do we know of man? According to Rosenzweig, at first we know nothing. Here he agrees with Luther, who in his Disputatio de Homine has juxtaposed his lack of original knowledge with the Aristotelian view of man as an animal rationale. To borrow from Ernst Cassirer's essay on man, both Rosenzweig and Luther take the crisis in man's knowledge of himself seriously, but they do this under different historical conditions of plausibility. For both, however, our lack of original knowledge is not an end, but the beginning of a new knowledge arising from the perspective, I quote Luther, that we perceive man in the source itself, which is God. That God is the source of life, and in his light we see light. Rosenzweig also returns to this insight of Psalm 36 when he speaks of man in need of redemption. With Rainer Wiehl, we can say that Rosenzweig's three-dimensional notion of experience integrates God beyond the duality of man and world, subject and object. This, for Rosenzweig, is a precondition for redemption. If, despite today's crisis of faith, we want to persist in our belief in man and to be able to hope for him, we have to believe in his creation by God, in his election to responsibility, and his dignity to become a co-worker in the task of redemption. For Rosenzweig, as for Luther, the understanding of man emerging out of the critical lack of knowledge in the beginning is a knowledge of faith. Luther speaks of this in contradiction to a philosophical tradition that views man as being good on the basis of his natural forces. Rosenzweig opposes the idealistic theories of self-consciousness, which had made the I into the most self-evident knowledge. The new knowledge of faith, however, has a different character in Luther and Rosenzweig. This difference within the symbolic forms of religion shape the role both authors have assigned to the concept of revelation. For Luther as well, I quote, "Man is a creature of God consisting of flesh and a living soul, built by the beginning in the image of God, without sin, with the purpose to procreate descendants and to rule over the created things and never to pass away," end of quote. However, Luther continues, after Adam's fall, man is subjugated under the might of the devil, namely sin and death. Both are evils not to be overcome by the strength of man. They are eternal malignancies. And here the Christian concept of redemption shines through, beginning with a typology of Adam and Christ in Paul, Romans 5. Such as all men have sinned in Adam, so all men can be redeemed in Christ. Luther does not continue the Augustinian interpretation of sin as a desire or longing, concupiscentia, which could lead the wrong way. He follows his tradition, though, insofar as he extolled the power of reason as the highest power of man. But in a way, the meaning of sin has been exaggerated up to Protestant Christianity, with the consequences that the evil instinct served as an occasion for a fundamental pessimism about man post lapsum. Walter Benjamin dealt with this pessimism in his Origin of German Tragic Drama, and Hermann Cohn in his late work Religion of Reason. This exaggeration has found its popular expression in a verse of the evangelic songbook, the Protestant Siddur, so to speak. Johann Sebastian Bach has dedicated an organ interpretation to this song, which sums up the Lutheran doctrine of justification. The stanza reads, "In Adam's fall is all depraved, man's nature and his wisdom. When we are born, within our veins is flowing deadly venom, and it is sure there is no cure but Christ who brought salvation. For Satan's lie led Eve to die, all men received damnation." To see things this way seems to be a historical phenomenon. The song has been excluded in the revised Protestant songbook, probably because this theology of sin is supposed to be too difficult for a contemporaneous consciousness. The drawback of this restraint, however, seems to be a loss of the ability to speak about sin, to give it a name, and this is just one example that the stirring of hate has today increased in many places of the world. Wolfhard Pannenberg, author of Anthropology in Theological Perspective, has described sin in its multiple forms, namely egomania, misdemeanor of oneself, and malice. It's reasonable to find in the evil instinct the root of many human problems. With Immanuel Kant, we can speak of a tendency to evil in human nature. However, to interpret the peccatum originale as a dogma of inherited sin is a legacy of myth, as Hermann Cohn put it. It is essential for Christianity to relate the belief in Christ as the Redeemer to the human condition after the fall. Thus, man, after the loss of paradise, is in search of the meaning of his life, and this is a search in which knowledge of faith can help him. Luther has put this knowledge in the formula simul justus et peccator, which means that although man has experienced the love of God, he is not immune against failure. I understand this formula as a mode of thoughtfulness, which can also be found in Cohn and Rosenzweig. They interpret the biblical tradition in a helpful way also for me as a theologian. Both correlate the experience of sin to reconciliation, which Cohn has described in a different way as Rosenzweig. Both agree in the conviction that the created soul, created with the potential to do good, can be constantly renewed. According to Rosenzweig, the experience of revelation opens up the possibility for a new beginning. In his understanding, the overcoming of sin consists only in the realization of the beloved soul in the moment of revelation that it has been without love in the past. The silent self was closed in itself. It knew nothing other than the concern of itself. It did not yet have the experience of a genuine encounter with the other. By virtue of the event of revelation, the beloved soul is now able to resist all tendencies to see in the other just a thing, an object, a he, be it the member of a social class or of another positive religion, or of a we, which can be viewed from the outside as a you others. Rosenzweig's concept of redemption is built on the experience of revelation. It bears the accent of reconciliation between God and man, as well as between man and the other. In The Star, Rosenzweig not only dealt with a traditional Christian concept of redemption, but, be it more implicitly or more explicitly, also with such theories critical of religion, which turned to radical transformation. I will limit myself to a few remarks on Marx, Nietzsche, and Wagner, although the Freudian theory as well could be read as a secularized program of redemption. For Karl Marx, his name is absent in The Star of Redemption, and we'll have a talk, I think, tomorrow on this topic. For Karl Marx, Karl Marx is absent in the Star of Redemption, but not the problems Marxism has brought about. For Karl Marx, redemption is no longer of interest in a religious sense. His topic is liberation from social conditions of alienation and violence. With powerful words, the introduction of the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right formulates this aim, I quote, "To knock down all conditions under which man is a humiliated, enslaved, and despised being," end of quote. The conviction that it would be possible to create a new man in real existing socialism by means of education belongs perhaps to the last utopias of history. The song The International put the corresponding picture of man in the following verse. "There are no supreme saviors, neither God nor Caesar nor tribune. Producers, let us save ourselves, decree the common salvation." Traditional Christianity and its institutionalized form of the church are accused of having concentrated their efforts on salvation, but not on the rescue from real misery. Consolation through soul care is opposed to liberation and emancipation. Looking back at the history of real existing socialism, however, it appears clearly enough that new man has only repeated the problems of the old, problems that had already existed since Greek antiquity. To put it in Walter Benjamin's words, the problem of fate as a guilt context of the living. In this iteration, the context of fate was now conceived as and legitimized through ideology, carried out by an authoritarian apparatus of state. For individual man, it became difficult to make the unspeakable rest heard, or what Rosenzweig calls in his critique of the philosophy of the all, individuum ineffabile triumphans. Unlike Marx, Nietzsche does not want to bring about the future of man through a revolution, but through a renaissance of an ancient relation of man to the world and to himself. The restoration of the tension between the principles of Dionysos and Apollon, according to his early writing, Birth of Tragedy, out of the spirit of music. In Innocence of Becoming, and here the critical echo of Christian interpretation of Genesis 3 is clearly audible, He calls for an overcoming of man as we know him through the self-overcoming of the Superman. Benjamin interprets. The thought of the Superman displaces the apocalyptic leap not in conversion, expiation, purification, and contrition, but in an intensification. The Superman is the historical man who has arrived without converting himself, who grew by trespassing heavens. Nietzsche inflicted damage to this explosion of heaven provoked by the intensification of the human who is and remains, from the religious viewpoint, guilty. End of quote. With the always intensified will to power, Nietzsche merely substituted a new absolutism in place of the old theological one that he had opposed with the words Rosenzweig quotes. If there was a God, how could I withstand not to be God? The Nietzschean Superman celebrates the apotheosis of man, and this means a relapse into the symbolic form of myth. Richard Wagner, the third person I want to speak very shortly about, was convinced that the maltreated world can only regenerate itself if the yearning for and promise of redemption could be kept awake. He tried to translate the dogmas which had become incomprehensible, just artificial, back into mythical symbols. This way he created an aestheticizing religion of art which should be able to rescue the core of religion. A metaphysics of life has taken the place of biblical testified experience. How does Rosenzweig answer to these transformations of the traditional Christian concept of redemption? He confronts the world of revelation with a pre-world of myth and works on myth in modernity. He puts his accent on the revelation of love, which enables the mute introvert self to become a speaking soul, living in relation to others without melting with them. In a letter to Gridley Rosenstock from June 1919, Rosenzweig writes that in the opera Tristan and Isolde, the difference being set by the relating little word and is denied. Through the experience of being related in difference, however, man is in the position to contribute to the task of redemption against all tendencies for reification or alienation from oneself and from the other. This can take place in a process of learning in the midst of everyday encounters, as per Rosenzweig's wonderful description, that redemption at its core is, I quote, nothing other than that the I learns to say you to the he. Being called into a process of learning to be responsible, the soul that is loved overcomes mythical thinking and feeling. Thoughts of the I are interrupted by what the other says. The I listens to his words and tries to answer them. To understand redemption this way means liberation from introversion and isolation, emancipation to a dialogical existence in private life as well as in the public sphere and in scholarly discourse. Redemption, understood through Rosenzweig, means a living resonance with others, with the world. Finally, I return to the question how the traditional concept of redemption can be applied to the meaning of consolation. Following the late Georg Simmel, I quote, "The notion of consolation has a broader, deeper meaning than we usually understand. Man is a being in search of consolation, and consolation is something different from help. The animal is also in search of help, but consolation is the strange, extraordinary experience which lets the suffering stay, but which cancels the suffering from suffering. Consolation does not concern the evil itself, but its reflection in the deepest instance of the soul." End of quote. If we understand redemption as rescue from all need, in accordance with the biblical understanding, it has a broader meaning than consolation. Redemption carries within it the help which can reverse misery. Moreover, it encompasses all temporal, physical, material well-being of bodily happiness as well as spiritual comfort. Again and again, a conflict has been fought between the two. However, there have also been efforts to mediate. To give an example from the Christian tradition, the plea of the Lord's Prayer for the daily bread precedes the plea for forgiveness from guilt and for redemption from the evil. Indeed, there is a profound factual connection between these three pleas, grounded in the recognition that man is a unity of body and soul, with a mind inseparable from his physical condition. Furthermore, man has to experiment with himself, a task which cannot be done without failing here and there, to make mistakes and to use the freedom to decide between different options without sometimes knowing which one is the right one. Redemption cannot be reduced to consolation, but consolation is an integral aspect of redemption. To give another example, both consolation and redemption are correlated in my interpretation in Benjamin's last thesis on the notion of history. Both share the task of remembrance, which is not being prevented by the storm of progress, I quote, "to pause, to wake up the dead, and to put together what has been shattered." End of quote. Beyond liberation, redemption here gains the meaning of responsibility to the past and coming generations. There is also consolation in the memoria, insofar as the man who remembers to dialogue with Blumenberg can rise up against the threatening indifference of universal time. As he remembers the others, they in turn build for him a world in which to be remembered is the only way to stay. In this sense, reverence for the dead, for the estate, their form of living is the earliest piece of culture that we know of. End of quote. In this anthropological framework of interpretation, we can take up the wonderful saying of the Baal Shem Tov that remembrance is the secret of redemption. Memoria and thoughtfulness make up an account of good forms of consolation in opposition to the less or even bad ones like nationalistic ideologies, totalitarian forms of government, or authoritarian regimes. In today's world, perhaps the horizon of the question of redeemability of man is a culturally mediated humanity that is able to move about the different symbolic forms in order to experience the process of a ripening own subjectivity in the community with others. Understood this way, The concept of redemption has to be translated from the big eschatological contents into the small living worlds in which memoria and thoughtfulness have to prove themselves, to also translate into the symbolic forms of the liturgical year in Judaism and Christianity, which Rosenzweig has described masterfully. Music as well belongs to these cultural forms, and it is not necessary to supercharge it in its meaning and to turn it into a substitute for religion as the Romantics did. Last but not least, forms of humor are included which can lead to a redeeming laughter, as Peter L. Berger has put it. Let me close with a little story I found in his wonderful book. In the old days, somewhere in Eastern Europe, a traveler arrived in a shtetl in the middle of winter. There, outside the synagogue, an old man sat on a bench, shivering in the cold. "What are you doing here?" asked the traveler. "I'm waiting for the coming of Messiah." "That is indeed a very important job," said the traveler. "I suppose that the community pays you a good salary." "No, not at all," said the old man. "They don't pay me anything. They just let me sit on this bench. Only in a while someone comes out and gives me a little food." "That must be very hard for you," said the traveler. "But even if they don't pay you anything, surely they must honor you for undertaking this important task." "No, not at all," said the old man. "They all think that I'm crazy." "I don't understand this," said the traveler. "They don't pay you, they don't respect you, you sit out here in the cold, shivering, hungry. What kind of a job is this?" The old man replied, "It's steady work." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Dober, for a wonderful talk. Pleased now to introduce our third and final speaker, after which we'll have a discussion. Introducing Professor Agata Bielik-Robson, who is professor and chair of Jewish Studies at the University of Nottingham and at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw. Professor Bielik-Robson has written widely in modern Jewish thought and continental philosophy. I'm just going to name 2 books. Most recently, in 2017, Jewish Crypto-Theologies of Late Modernity, Philosophical Moranos. And in 2011, The Saving Lie, Harold Bloom, and Deconstruction. I introduce to you Professor Bielik-Robson.
Thank you so much. It's really late. I'll try to be. Can you hear me? Is it working? No?
Yeah.
You just have to speak. Is it working now? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah, it should be good. Well, I have a subtitle. So the question is Human Being Redeemable? A little meditation on Rosenzweig's claim that death is very good. At the end of the first part of the Star, devoted to the concept of creation, Rosenzweig famously states about death. Unlike other created things which are just good, death is very good, and as such the true crown and gem of the creaturely world. Not something to be deplored as the sign of transience, reeking of decay, but to be praised and cherished as the finishing touch to the enterprise of creation. A quote. Within the framework of the universal yes of creation, which carries all the singular on its broad back, a domain is delimited which receives a different yes, a yes qualified by very, different from everything else, something that, while in the creation, points beyond creation. This very, which announces a transcreation right within creation, within the world, a beyond of the world, something other than life while belonging to life and only to life, created at the same time as life, as its ending point, and yet allowing life to have an inkling of a fulfillment beyond it. This is death. The created death of the creature is at the same time the sign that announces the revelation of life, which transcends that of the simple creature. That is why, concerning the sixth day of creation, it is not said that it was good, but look, very good. Very good, our men of old teach us, very good, this is death. A tall order to praise death, and most of the commentators found it indeed far too tall. In fact, more than that, simply contradictory to Rosenzweig's main thrust of going into life, which constitutes the main imperative of the star, graphically formatted as an arrow pointing in the direction of der Mitte des Lebens. But I would like to show that there is no contradiction involved in Rosenzweig's love of life and his apology of death. What he loves and wants us to love is the finite life, life offered in its finitude, which should in the end appear as enough, that is, sufficient and fit for everything we could want from life, redemption included. The beyond towards which death as the end gestures is not a promise of immortality, offering a transcendence in temporal terms infinitely prolonged. To Rosenzweig's still Hegelian mind, this is the epitome of bad infinity, which perpetuates creaturely life in quantum without transforming it as a qualitative renewal, which is Rosenzweig's main purpose. This renewal can also be framed in Hegel's terms as the infinite in the finite. Redemption takes place either here and now, in the potentiality of the finite moment, or nowhere and never at all. Although, as we shall see in the moment, its execution takes a different form than in Hegel's system, too in Menendez for Rosenzweig, who longs for the transcendence of eternity, yet not to be confused with the immortal life of an isolated soul. It is rather a question of transition from isolation to connectedness. So, to the question, is human being redeemable? Rosenzweig says yes, but only on the condition that it relinquishes the hope for living on forever. In other words, if it gives up on the idea of redemption as personal immortality. More than that, in his understanding of Judaism as the religion of the finite life, Rosenzweig also implies that the wish to stay forever in being is in fact the root of all evil. He is not alone in this implication. Levinas's critique of Spinoza goes exactly in this direction. Conatus represents for him an egotistic vitalist urge which would have warded off death forever if it only could. And even if Levinas is a bit unfair to Spinoza himself, who actually did not believe in the immortality of the soul, his construction of conatus as a pure will of life indeed excludes any inner sense of limitation. The end, death, always comes from the outside. Rosenzweig is less harsh on Spinoza, but he also modifies his notion of conatus. It is no longer a will to live, potentially forever, but a will to stay, to remain, which has an idea of a limit already inscribed in itself. The will to remain, therefore, wards off death, but in the condition of finitude. It is a new and subtle proposition, situating itself between the phantasm of life pure and infinite, which Levinas ascribes to Spinoza on the one hand, and the Heideggerian concept of Sein zum Tode, in which life itself becomes swallowed up by death, and the process of the finite living becomes indistinguishable from dying. the will to stay, to remain, of which Rosenzweig speaks in the opening paragraph of The Star, is the drive characteristic of another finitude, desiring and investing in life without at the same time wishing to prolong itself into infinity, knowing the blessing of the limit implied by the phrase, very good, this is death. The closest to Rosenzweig's intuition is Derrida, for whom the phantasmatic lure of absolute life equals absolute evil. Yet, simultaneously, he also wishes to stay, to remain in being, provided it does not take the form of the vitalist Wille zum Leben, but merely a will to survive. Derrida's survie, just as Rosenzweig's will to remain, acknowledge the limit, yet does not give up on life and such. Even more, as Derrida says in his last seminar, already aware of the terminal cancer diagnosis, he does not want to be robbed of life's finitude. This formula, to be robbed of one's finitude, suggests that indeed death must be very good, a kind of treasure not to be easily taken away by the promise of conquering death offered by the Pauline Christianity. We will find something very similar in late Adorno too, in his beautiful meditations on Goethe, written just few months before his death, devoted to the idea of reconciliation with nature, most of all with the natural condition of finitude. The ultimate redemptive gesture, Adorno says, is to yield, but with no self-denial. That is, to accept the finis, yet without giving up on life, dreaming of happiness and fulfillment, which Adorno openly calls with the theological term, redemption. In all these thinkers drawing on the sources of Judaism, in their polemic with Christian overestimation of immortality, the same motif repeats itself over and over again. Redemption, yes, but within the finite life. The infinite, yes, but not beyond, rather internal to finitude. But how is this to be achieved? And isn't it precisely what Hegel calls the living contradiction? The image of the finite life as a potential infinite in the finite or a living contradiction appears indeed for the first time in Hegel. For Hegel, the living contradiction cannot be endured as such. Life, deeply aporetic in itself, inaugurates dialectical process, the goal of which is to solve the original aporia, or in Hegel's own words, the reconciliation of the infinite and the finite. This reconciliation cannot be, however, achieved in life itself. In order to properly embrace the infinite, life must be sublated into the higher element of the spirit, unlike life capable of looking the negativity of death straight into eye. Therefore, as long as life is an existing and abiding, not yet reconciled contradiction, its dominant manifestation is pain. Now a quote from Hegel. Pain is the prerogative of all living natures. Because they are the existent notion, they are an actuality of infinite power, such that they are within themselves the negativity of themselves, that this their negativity is for them, and that they maintain themselves in their otherness. In other words, they would like to live forever, but they sense they're going to die. It is said that contradiction is unthinkable, but in fact, in the pain of a living being, it is even an actual existence. Okay, but if in case of life, contradiction not only is thinkable, but also actual, then perhaps it would also be possible to suspend the teleology of reconciliation, the solution to the human paradox, and maintain oneself in it. After all, Hegel himself says that pain is a prerogative, not just a drawback or imperfection to be removed by higher stages of thought, but a positive moment, the moment of the birth of dialectics. Finite life, therefore, is the bedrock of the dialectical method and the proof of its validity as well. Based the common sense belief that contradiction is unthinkable, every living thing as such demonstrates its painful, seemingly impossible actuality. The Hegelian life in pain constitutes the punctum crucis, but also, theologically speaking, a cross on which life's infinite power simultaneously incarnates itself, suffers, and then dies. Yet, pays Hegel, after all a Christian thinker of resurrection, even if in its most heterodox forms, Rosenzweig will rather attempt to endure in what the former sees as an unbearable condition of a disappearing moment, which only triggers the dialectical process. A process that, in Hegel's version, takes the form of the salvific escape from life into a higher form of the spirit. But within the negative dialectics proposed by Rosenzweig, why not to see him as a precursor of Adorno, stays and remains in life. On this alternative reading, the prerogative of pain should not be too easily superseded because it carries an equally crucial message, that every finite life suffers because of its unfulfilled wish of more life, or that despite its finitude, it still wants to be redeemed, get out of the condition of transience, which condemns it to death and oblivion, into eternity, which will not have to be the same as personal immortality, perpetuating my life forever. The pain is thus a privilege. It is a living question which wants to know if the finite can somehow contain the infinite, become more life within mere life. That is, in the paradigmatic formulation of Martin Luther, bequeathes to Hegel and then to Rosenzweig, is finitum capax infinity, is the finite capable of the infinite. Rosenzweig claims that it is. The finite can contain the redemptive infinite within itself without questioning its limits. For Rosenzweig, the Jewish formula, love strong as death, defines love precisely as a corrective force that can be revealed only after the painful knowledge of death. In his variation on, as well as deviation from the Hegelian theme, Rosenzweig maintains that it is not the death-bound spirit, but the life-loving soul that can solely abide in the living contradiction. Yet, the gentle touch or small voice, but call of love means nothing to those who did not experience the disintegrating power of death. It can only come as the second birth of the selfhood after it became deadened in the traumatic process of separation. This is why, for Rosenzweig, the deadly stage of the tragic hero, in which man severs his communal relations and dies for the world, is indispensable in the process of revelation. Just as the nihilistic stage of modern disenchantment, in which man withdraws his living participation from the deadened cosmic nature, is necessary to hear the small voice of Judaism as religion of the finite life. The more modest post-atheistic kind of faith, which does not promise immortality, but only singularity capable to enter into intense relations with other singularities as its neighbors. In the Star of Redemption, the eternal relevance of Judaism lies precisely in that. Once the great voice of the Neoplatonic Pauline Christianity begins to wane due to the process of modern disenchantment, Judaism offers itself as a religious solution to the rediscovery of human finitude, proposing its own re-enchantment of faith, hope, and love, but not staking them on the promise of spiritual immortality. The star, therefore, contains a positive alternative to the negative and death-oriented philosophical accounts of finitude, which stem from the early 20th century Kojevian, Heideggerian, thanatic strain. The awakening of the Judaic tradition means also awakening to a new sense of life after the slumber of the virtual death caused by the sudden demise of the hopes of immortality. While the Thanatic philosophical account of finitude can, in Rosenzweig's words from the start, only recommend suicide, his new thinking aims to reflect the primordial wish of every living being to stay, to remain. Hence, just as the Rosenzweigian tragic hero who became intimately acquainted with death can solely acknowledge the principle of love strong as death, so are we, late modern men, thoroughly immersed in the thanatic disenchantment of the 20th century philosophies of finitude, ready to appreciate the small-voiced proposition of a way out of the experience of nihilism. We are not asked to discard our knowledge of negativity altogether. Quite to the contrary, another finitude is based on the trauma of negativity and merely offers its Durcharbeiten, very Freudian concept, a working through in which finitude gradually loses its traumatic aspect and emerges under other auspices, no longer the closure of death, but the opening of love. Now the quote from Rosenzweig: "The bond of the consummate and redemptive bonding of man and the world is to begin with neighbor, and evermore only the neighbor, the well-nigh nighest. Love glides from one bearer to the other, the next one from one neighbor to the next neighbor. It is not satisfied until it has paced off the whole orbit of creation. It leaves its traces everywhere in its migration by providing the plural of things everywhere with the sign of singularity." But this process of gliding from one bearer to another, this gradual pacing off the whole orbit of creation, cannot happen all at once, for no shortcuts are allowed here. No jumps to general categories that would circumvent the singularity of every concrete neighbor, which the Rosenzweigian love encounters. Love is a lifelong, continuous, and always incomplete process of solving the living contradiction between the infinite and the finite, where the endlessly open, transitional, and relational nature of love offers a dynamic synthesis in the form of indefinity, not the infinity of essence or an immortal soul, which human life does not possess, but the infinity of what Rosenzweig calls an essence that can fall for and thus become, if only for a moment of bonding, anything and everything. If, according to Heidegger, life of an essence is fallenness, Verfallenheit, then indeed the finitude spent under the sun of love is constantly falling in love for all the things it cares, simultaneously taking them in and pouring itself out on them, becoming all of them in the process. The redemptive moment of love, therefore, lies not in the infinite intensity, something Benjamin talks about, the concentrated immortal essence of the individual called first the self and then the soul, but in the potentially infinite extension, in the bond, gliding from one bearer to another and eventually pacing the whole orbit of creation. In his account of love as dynamic and plastic, all-reaching and all-binding connection, Rosenzweig relies heavily on German Romanticism. Hölderlin's Bonds of Love, Liebesbande, Novalis, but most of all Goethe, who famously said that love connects all, Liebe verbindet alles, and that, I love this quote, if you want infinity, go into all directions of the finite. Novalis repeats this wisdom almost verbatim. Die Basis aller ewiger Verbindung ist eine absolute Tendenz nach allen Richtungen. The ground of all eternal connection is an absolute tendency in all directions. Rosenzweig's love is precisely such an attempt in all directions, the purpose of which is to turn, metamorphose, the monolith of being, organized hierarchically according to general categories, into a horizontal community of the numberless singulars. That's Rilke's term, numberless singulars, capable to relate to one another in the form of eternal connection. It is thus not the singular essence of a thing which is capable of achieving eternity, but only a singularity entangled in the bonds of love with its neighbors, together forming a constellation which transforms the world by pushing it towards metaphysical fulfillment. As Rosenzweig says, God and man already are, but the world is becoming. The world is not yet complete. The eternity, therefore, which in Rosenzweig's system replaces personal immortality, is precisely the Novalisian, Goethean, eternal connection, which, far from being a fleeting moment on the surface of things, contributes to the creation of the world, to its emergence out of the indifference into the growth of life, which Georges Canguilhem, the best philosopher of life after Bergson, defines precisely as the attempt in all directions. The bonds of love which connect anything to anything, from the ordinary acts of neighborly love, through the speech acts of calling and addressing, which leave traces of the eternal connection in language, to all the variants of the Spinozi's amor intellectualis, which holds all the potential singularities in one loving gaze. All these forms of love not only foster and accelerate the growth of life, but also anticipate the redemptive stage of world's full being. In Rosenzweig's version of Wordsworth's ode on the intimations of immortality, here to be replaced by eternity, love is precisely this eternal connection that allows whatever was, ever be, yet not through granting each thing an immortality in isolation, but only in the fulfilled eternal configuration of the world. Now the quote again. Every neighbor who appears unexpectedly must be anything, a substitute of every other one and of all others. He is not permitted to ask questions or to differentiate. It is his neighbor. But from the world's point of view, it is on the contrary man's act of love that is the unpredicted, the unhoped for, the big surprise. It is in itself that the world carries the law of its growing life. The world knows only, or thinks it knows, that all life must die. And when it desires eternity, it does so by waiting for an intervention from the outside that will procure immortality for life. It is only when and where the members of this living organism are covered by the breath of love for the neighbor, a breath that breathes soul into them. It is only when they add to their life what life itself could not give them, a soul eternity. The act of love, therefore, only apparently is effective on the chaos of anything. In truth, without knowing it, it presupposes that the world, all the world with which it has anything to do, is growing life. And it is thanks to love that the seed of eternal life has been planted. The infinite is no longer opposed to the finite. Life no longer stands opposite the absolute, but now lives in the absolute. For Rosenzweig, the exemplary figure which embodies this new relation of the infinite in the finite is the saint. Quote, "The saint is the perfect man, that is to say, he who lives absolutely in the absolute, the man open to the highest things and resolute in the highest actions. In contrast to the hero, the tragic hero, who is always enclosed in the same darkness of the self, in the place assumed by the Lord of his self in the primordial world, the tragic hero, there appears in the new world, constantly renewed, the servant of his God. It is therefore the saint, not the mystic, the heir of the tragic condition of isolation, who is the true servant of his God, because he realizes that love for God must be externalized in love for the neighbor. It must leave the enclosure of the self, which Hegel calls the beautiful soul of radical, intensive inwardness, and find a way out towards Entäußerung, the outward expression as well as extension. By securing the eternal connection of all worldly things, neighbors, by covering them with the net of love, the saint acts as the agent of eternity. Himself already eternalized, thanks to the all-connecting bonds which breathe soul into worldly phenomena, he anticipates the moment of redemption in which the whole world will have become an all-connected community of souls. The redemption of the human being, therefore, lies not in the solitary gain of spiritual immortality, but in the messianic practice of overcoming the isolation of things, making them all connected, that is, in the process of mending the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind the speakers that in just a moment, after I summarize quickly what we've heard and ask you a question that I have, then I'm going to be asking you to pose some questions to each other, just to remind you. Let me offer a possible summary of what we just heard up here, and it goes something like this. Professor Liska spoke to us about a thinker named Franz Rosenzweig and his conception of redemption, which Professor Liska adamantly rejects. This conception of redemption is so obsessed with the one, with the all, with the eternal and the true, that it forgets concrete life in the present. Professor Liska rejects this form of redemption so strongly that she's offended by anyone who might take the standpoint from which to ask whether the human being is redeemable. And so she says the human being should not be redeemable. And instead, she advocates a position that she identifies with Walter Benjamin, who offers an account of the messianic, which Professor Liska described as having a weak messianic force, offering the possibility of messianic sparks or splinters in the concrete. And so I imagine Professor Liska was simply thrilled to be introduced by Professor Dober and Professor Bielik-Robson to another thinker who we can call, just for argument's sake, Franz Rosenzweig, who offers a completely different account of redemption. This is redemption in the concrete, redemption which is in the finite or nowhere at all. Redemption which we can understand simply as the moment in which an I learns to say you to a he. Redemption in the world whereby singularities are united with one another in harmony, offering consolation, grounded in a knowledge of faith. So I wonder what our panelists would have to say once they realized that Franz Rosenzweig and Franz Rosenzweig are in fact the same thinker. And secondly, I would ask the speakers to reflect on what it is we are embracing and what it is we are rejecting when we speak of redemption in these two different ways and why we're embracing and rejecting redemption in these different ways. Yeah,
May I start? Thank you. I felt that there was a certain biased animosity. I think you have to defend yourself, and that's okay. I agree with much of what you said. You somewhat overemphasized but that's fine. You also dropped my acceptance of Rosenzweig on certain terms, which is where I ended up, talking about his Bauleute and associating them with the builders that I've talked about. But that's okay. I forgive you. I guess forgiveness is probably along with consolation and love among
redeemed.
those.
Redeemed.
Yes. And with this, I almost replied, because where I do not completely agree with you is that I encountered a completely different Rosenzweig. And I don't know if I should add my questions immediately, or
Maybe
you
not
want to
yet,
have it
but-
separate. But
But can you say why you don't agree that it's a different Rosenzweig?
because the description of love and the description of consolation are very much in tune with the Rosenzweig. I wouldn't say reject, I wouldn't be so radical, but I prefer not to emulate.
Thank you.
Does this one work?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Well, for me it was, I wrote down one sentence you said from Karl Kraus. The closer you look at it, the stronger it looks back.
The stranger.
The stranger it looks back, and I think this sums up some difficulties with the term redemption. We have discussed this today in the panels, and in our three presentations, it was backed up that there is a plurality of meanings. And what I found in your presentation is that there is a similarity of the early Benjamin, the theological political fragment, and Rosenzweig. I think there is a similarity.
Absolutely.
And if we read Rosenzweig through the glasses of the theological political fragment, perhaps the language of Rosenzweig, the lyrics he uses, the verse you quoted, ewiger Lobgesang der Erlösung, sounds different. So we can understand it perhaps better if we look from other perspectives to Rosenzweig. And this was for me a very important perspective. And I think there is also no dissent between our three presentations, that we have to look from different points to Rosenzweig.
This is what reconciliation looks like in practice.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I would say in favor of Vivian's interpretation that I'm not totally comfortable with Rosenzweig's views of redemption. And that's why I concentrated on love as the proposition of like extension, all connectedness, instead of intensive sense of immortality. And this kind of a polemic moment in Rosenzweig against a Pauline Christianity, so to say. Then on the second part of the third unit of the star, which is devoted to the we of the eternal people, which indeed I find often quite disturbing. This is this kind of a oneness, unity, the harmony that I find stifling, which I don't find in Rosenzweig's account of love. And that is for me a difficult moment in the third part of the Star of Redemption, in which, honestly, I don't see the transition. I don't know what's going on there. That we have in the introduction to the third part, a beautiful essay on love as a kind of an active attitude of the saint that is fed up by disappointments, that does not look for fulfillment. It just wants to spread love without actually awaiting any love in return. And then this idea of the Jewish saint who's actually spreading those acts of love is being abandoned. And 20 pages later, we actually learn that it's the role of the Christian to do it, whereas the Jewish eternal people are basically like sort of sink into themselves and only cherish the prayers and rituals. This is a mystery to me. I don't know exactly what's going on there. But I sort of detect this kind of a mistrust in Vivian, I think directed precisely against this latter vision, and I share it. In favor of Rosenzweig, on the other hand, I would say that what he says about love, when he draws on German Romanticism, in which he messianizes in his own kind of way, Hölderlin, Goethe, Novalis, I see, his affinity with Benjamin, with Adorno, and for instance, when Benjamin talks about 2 poems of Hölderlin, he actually talks about Erstreckung, the idea of extension, as something that replaces the former idea of intensive immortality. Right? The role of the poet is to connect via language as many living beings as possible in order to form this kind of a net of extension, of connectedness that is as good, Hölderlin says, as the promise of personal immortality. Right? You can die once you've done it, right? You connected all the things and rescued them or saved them from the isolation, right? You can die, right? Because you sort of fulfilled your mission. So in a way, what Benjamin says, or for example, when Adorno also in his Meditations on Goethe says that what language, poetry helps us to achieve is this good togetherness of life, right? He doesn't mean the stifling sense of unity, harmony, oneness. It's this dynamic good togetherness, all connectedness of life, which is a kind of a blueprint of eternity for Rosenzweig too. So basically, I would like to say there are ways, right, in which we can rescue Rosenzweig from this accusation of stifling harmony and bring him actually closer to people like Benjamin or Adorno.
Thank you very much. Now I think I would like to give our speakers the chance to pose questions to one another. Maybe we start with you, Professor Dober. Do you have a question for Professor Liska?
Yes, I would like to hear whether you could answer the question Rosenzweig didn't answer, how it could be that the people who wrote the Bible have thought like Kafka thinks. Do you have yourself an answer to this question?
The question might be whether this is the Rosenzweig, Agata made a distinction between two. Would that be the one of the all and the one that goes toward redemption, or would it be the one that you described as leading up to that? I maybe wouldn't immediately make the distinction between the love and the redemption, but we'll come to that. So I wonder whether, in which spirit he said that. I don't think that he had the God in mind that features in my Abraham story. Because it is one that is there, and Kafka does not negate that mount is there. But there is something to be afraid of as well. So there is the double movement of hope and fear, of going toward, and yet at the same time concentrating on the task of building the house because there might be something there that would terminate the human being.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Bielik-Robson, do you have a question for Professor Dober?
Well, I was thinking about it when I was listening to your reflections on Luther. Right? It's like, have you also like given a thought to the idea that this Luther's, it's a fantastic formula, this finitum capax infinity. You know, it's actually something that started a completely new reflection in the German thought, beginning with Hegel, but then, like, in a way, fulfilled in Rosenzweig. I mean, I'm very much against the idea that, you know, Rosenzweig completely broke with Hegel and starting something new. I think that there's a constant, like, variation on and deviation from Hegel at the same time. But this idea of finitum capax infinity is very close to Rosenzweig's heart, isn't it?
I agree with you. Yes, we can read the chapter of Revelation, I think, exactly in this sense. To hear the voice of the other, to be interrupted by the other, by the divine other, and by the human other, both oscillates a little bit. Indeed, the infinite can get into the finite. The finite can be capable to receive the infinite. I think this is right. This is an analogy to Luther, which I haven't seen yet. Thank you.
Professor Liska, do you have a question for Bielik-Robson?
I have a very simple one. How do you reconcile? So first of all, I want to tell you that I really appreciated your talk very much. Both of them learned a lot, and I learned from you how you integrate the acceptance of death also into what I embrace in my own talk. So my question is directly related to that. The way you said to stay, to remain, was clearly distinguished from the rejection. To want to stay, to remain, was in the tone in which you said it, clearly distinguished from not wanting to die. And yet, I could feel it in your performance, but not in the logic.
Well, it is a difficult issue, and I wanted merely to signal this kind of a new subtle position, which I think Rosenzweig inaugurates, and people like Derrida or Adorno follow. Not wanting to die is actually a more characteristic of to stay, to remain. It is a problem of survival rather than the kind of a vitalistic problem of the original will to live, or conatus conceived in a Spinozist kind of way. Because in fact, I mean, this is what Spinoza says quite openly, conatus does not nothing about death. So you can't say that according to conatus, you don't want to die, because that would imply a kind of a knowledge of death. Conatus is a blind impulse of living, in which the life does not understand anything of death. If death comes to such life, it only comes from the outside. In other words, conatus or Wille zum Leben in Nietzsche, or in any kind of a classical Lebensphilosophy, works as this blind impulse of which Freud says that the unconscious doesn't know death. In our unconscious, we all think we're going to live forever. Well, this is precisely what Rosenzweig wants to break with this little substitution. Instead of saying, I want to leave, he says, I want to stay, to remain. That means that the knowledge of death is incorporated as the internal limit into the desire to survive. It seems like a subtle difference, but it actually is an enormous difference, right? Because it changes the condition, it changes our understanding of life, precisely the way Derrida wants to see it. No longer pure life, absolute life, infinite life. These are all very phantasmatic and evil conjectures, according to both Rosenzweig and Derrida. So not terms in the life infinite, but always in terms of survie, a survival, which is already incorporated a knowledge of death. That's why for Rosenzweig, the knowledge of death, mediated by the stage of the tragic hero, is absolutely necessary for the later process of revelation and redemption. Redemption does not sublate the knowledge of death, right? In some kind of a Hegelian manner. It subsumes it. It means that redemption can only take place within the finite life, but it has to be like worked through from the what he calls dark and traumatic knowledge of death into an affirmative vision in which actually it is love who fulfills the function of transgressing the isolated finite. Actually, what he wants to say, it's very simple, that the pain of mortality is so intense only because of the isolation of the individual being. If this isolation is broken, if we're saved from this condition of isolation, then mortality stops being such a painful, traumatic issue. That's what he says, at least. I mean, I'm not...
Very, very interesting. I want to come back to the two Rosenzweigs because I think I think now that we're coming to the end of the second of our two evening discussions, there's a real pattern here that's been continued over the two evenings. Where there's been a real push to reject absolutist or totalizing accounts of redemption as too dangerous to entertain, and a real desire to hold on to some viable conception of redemption in the concrete. And it seems to me that one of the ways in which Rosenzweig is such a challenging thinker for us is that he seems to think we need both, and that is the two Rosenzweigs really are the same Rosenzweig, and he seems to think that we can't have that redemption in the concrete without some kind of picture on the horizon of ultimate redemption. We might say we can't have a weak messianic force unless we have a conception of what some kind of ultimate messianic force is. So I'm interested in now. One thing would be to say that we prefer a modest version of redemption to the ultimate form. But another thing would be to think about what it would take to make that argument. What would it take to make a compelling argument for a concrete redemption that doesn't need the ultimate redemption on the horizon? That's, I think, a question.
Yes, of course it is. Do you want to say anything to it?
Well, I pleaded for the
Question mark?
For the question mark and for the all-day life and for the little forms, not for the big eschatological forms. And I would like to return to the question you brought up. For me, there stays a tension between the sentence that death is very good and the will of finite man to remain. And my question would be, is there another way than prayer to remain if man has to die? And would be the answer to this prayer perhaps what is the motto of the late work of Cohn? I say it in German. Er möge aufbewahrt sein im Gebinde des Lebens, he may be preserved in the interrelation. So only in relation to the other, the will to remain can be redeemed, so to speak. Not in relation to myself. I agree totally with you. In Benjamin, there is one wonderful formula set against Nietzsche. Es gäbe eine ungesteigerte Menschlichkeit. And not enlarged humanity. Not Superman, but humanity, as it is.
Well, I'll say to that, I think that there is no contradiction. And that's the whole point. I mean, in a way it is, because Hegel calls it a living contradiction, that there is a tension between the knowledge of death and the will to remain. Although the very fact that we want to remain already acknowledges that kind of the inner limit in form of death. But it's precisely this living contradiction which Hegel and then Rosenzweig endorse as most productive and creative in human being. That is the fact that it cannot be solved. And here is again this polemical moment against the Pauline Christianity, which I already find in Hegel actually. That it cannot be resolved, this living contradiction, by simply offering a life, a possibility to go on forever. That is not a solving contradiction. It's actually telling the life, you will go on the way it is, the way you are, you know, with no end, and that's it. So Hegel says that can't be so, right? And Rosenzweig even more so. If this contradiction is to be solved, there has to be some kind of a qualitative leap, some kind of a renewal, like a modification of this life. So it is being like shaken off all its sort of isolation, egoism, and constant like self-concern. What Heidegger calls Angst und Sorge, and which is, as you know, always jemeinig, always absolutely like self-centered, right? And obsessed just with itself. It's jemeinig, always mine. Here there's this idea of breaking it through, and this breakthrough is this new solution. And I think that Rosenzweig finds it in love, which he understands as Goethe's, you know, transposition of the infinite. You know, if you want infinity, go into all directions of the finite, right? You don't need some version of immortality, right? You just do it here and now, just connect things together, break them out of their isolation. And I think that there is in Rosenzweig, you're absolutely right, this strong image of the redeemed world, which is very hard to fathom. But I think it's all about this all-connectedness. And actually, you know, many people think that Rosenzweig had nothing to do with Kabbalah, especially the Lurianic Kabbalah. But his idea of redemption very much resembles the idea of the community of souls, or this connectedness of isolated sparks, which is the final redemptive moment in the Lurianic Kabbalah. Right? The resurrected God is not obviously the God who starts the whole process of creation, but it is it's like in a gestalt. It is a gestalt made out of the all-connectedness of all separated sparks of individual things, which are awakened to this passion of relationality, of being in relation. And I think this is this mega image of redemption, which hovers over Rosenzweig's metaphysics, which finds its sort of execution in the redemptive acts of the saints, who actually does it. Well, I mean, it's like awakens the sparks into this kind of all connectivity.
We just have a couple minutes left, and so it's unfair for me to ask the question that I'm now going to ask, but I feel like it would be wrong not to take the opportunity to pose it. We opened the conference yesterday with Professor Meir speaking to us about religious difference, and then this position that he coined trans difference. And of course, Rosenzweig thinks that when he's giving the concept of redemption in the second part of the Star, he's giving an account of redemption that would hold for different religions, for Christianity and for Judaism. But Professor Dober presented us with a Rosenzweig inspired very much by Luther and then, of course, the Christian tradition. And Professor Bielik-Robson emphasized that it was this Jewish account of the love between singularities that should be emphasized. Are we really dealing with the same notion of redemption, or are they different? And if they're different, are they reconcilable? In 22 seconds and counting.
What do you think?
They are reconcilable in difference.
Very nice. That's too easy to end with.
Too easy.
It's late.
Okay. With that, I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers for very stimulating discussion.